Professor Smith, in your lecture at TU Munich, you put the emphasis on Adam Smith's less well-known work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and you extract a certain aspect from it that is, I would say, overlooked in a way, which is that concept of, the fellow feeling, as I think it's a term Smith has coined, general human compassion that comes in when we look at how individuals act economically. In a nutshell, why is it so important to look at that book if we study modern markets of any kind?
Well, I was attracted to the theory of moral sentiments originally because I had data that I couldn't understand. You see, the two-person games that we started to do in the 1980s and the 1990s, particularly the trust games, the standard models failed miserably there. The maximization models, and yet the subjects in these experiments were on average making more money than they would have made if they had followed those prescriptions. And the reason is that they were departing from a strict self-interest and showing what we call other regarding behavior, and that turned out actually to pay. So now I didn't originally go to the theory of moral sentiments with the idea that I would learn that. I was reading the theory of moral sentiments sort of independently of that, and in fact started to use it in the classroom. But gradually, as I read Adam Smith's first book over and over, I didn't get it the first time, I didn't get it the second time, I began to think more about these issues the way he did. And I realized that he would not have any trouble with the trust games, his system, you see. And it's kind of has to do with the rules we follow in our more intimate groups, families, extended families, friends, neighbors, you see, those communities. That's what the first book is about. It's about human sociality, how that grows out of the human experience in small groups. That when someone takes an action that is of a beneficent nature and is properly motivated, that is, meaning it's intentional, we feel gratitude. And we're inclined to reward that. If someone does something hurtful intentionally, we feel resentment and we want to punish that. Well, those propositions in Adam Smith do a really nice job of organizing the kind of data that we got on these trust games. I don't mean that they explain it all, but roughly 2/3 of it, and the traditional model explained none of it. So that was pretty impressive. And
we should make clear at this point what the trust games actually are. Can you sort of briefly put into a nutshell what the configuration is? Yeah.
Imagine we're in the laboratory, and there's, say, 12 people in the room, and I am matched with you. I'll never know who you are. You'll never know who I am. Okay, so we're matched anonymously. And one of the first experiments we did, suppose I'm the first mover in this game. Well, I can, if I opt out, if I don't move to you, let's say we each get $10. If I move to you, and the idea there's some sort of synergy, the sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If I move to you, suppose the $20 becomes 40, okay? All right, I can give you 15 and keep 25, or I can take all the money. Now, in those days, we looked at that game, and what my colleagues and I did, we deliberately took quite an extreme case, where if person one passed to person two could take it all. Half of the persons one passed the persons two in the first set of experiments that we did, and 3/4 of them play the 15-25. 25% take all the money. Well, that's pretty impressive because this is completely anonymous. And so it's explaining that puzzle that I found great wisdom in reading Adam Smith.
Isn't the question on within these games and these setups of people, you know, I assume sitting at a table and going through these games, that they know each other's intention? Is that important? It seems to be very important.
Well, they have to infer it. You see, if I'm the first mover and I can give us each 10, but instead I move to you in a situation where you can take all the money. You see, in a way, it's hard to criticize my intentions as not being entirely interested in benefiting, not only you, but myself, of course. But on the other hand, I can lose it all. So it puts you see, as I interpret Adam Smith's proposition on this, you feel gratitude for that. Most of the individuals feel gratitude, and so they don't take all the money. And remember, if it's 10-10 and it becomes 15-25, you see, as the person who's passing to you, I'm only asking for a 50% increase, and I'm giving you 150%. On what it would otherwise be. So it's a strong signal, you see, and people respond to that. But we didn't have any way, you see, at the time in traditional economics for understanding that.
Mm-hmm. Which is sort of leading us directly into that also interesting concept of an asymmetry between gains and losses, which is, I think, a Smithian, Adam Smithian
Yes.
Concept. Can you explain that and how that comes in here?
Well, Adam Smith, in the first place, he saw on the gain side, the thing that motivated people was the desire for praise and praiseworthiness. We like to do things that other people approve. And also we like to, even if, for example, we do games where not only are the two individuals anonymous with respect to each other, the experimenter can't ever know who made what decision. Mm-hmm. And now people behave a little more selfish in that situation, but there seems to be still a strong praiseworthy, that in your own mind, you feel that what you're doing is right and worthy of praise. So those were in the gain domain. And then on the loss, Smith says we very much want to avoid blame and blameworthiness. And these are not only asymmetric, but the downside is far worse than the upside. And he derives that from the notion that there's an asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow. And he says to lose wealth and status and esteem is far more serious than the possibility of simply adding to our current state. And I think that asymmetry, of course, is an important part of the findings of a lot of the work in modern psychology.
Well, why? I mean, because it's often said that sort of traditional mainstream economics sort of wasn't very successful explaining what you were just describing.
Yes.
Game theory sort of has no point to connect to exactly these outcomes and explain them. Why is that? I mean, why hasn't anybody else sort of thought about that earlier, or is it really the achievement of experimental economics?
Well, I think, you see, the whole classical tradition coming from Adam Smith, but also David Hume, put more emphasis on process, you see, than in the neoclassical kind of revolution in economics, where we discovered the power of marginal utility in explaining a lot of prices and this sort of thing. Equilibrium in outcomes became the focus of attention, not the processes whereby people might get to an outcome. And I think that was the great loss in the neoclassical revolution. Instead of taking new concepts of equilibrium and sort of adding them to the traditional framework of thinking, they tended to substitute. And as a result, I think this led to a lot of problems in economics, which I think we're overcoming them. We understand more about the role of institutions, for example, and in markets, than I think we're prepared to accept earlier. So there's been an advance, but at this level of person-to-person interactions, I think we didn't adequately deal with that. And the neat thing about Adam Smith, you see, is he wrote 2 books. The one has to do with rules and order in our social world, and the other is about rules of order in our commercial life. And actually, commerce is just trading, grows out of sociality. So I think there's a unity there that is an important tradition for us to return to, and it can be enriched by modern better understanding of institutions and equilibrium and all of those advances.
To round off your lecture a little bit, you expanded to the point where you say, well, the emergence of law and property rights is also pointed at by Adam Smith already, because he, in a way, says this is sort of the natural state of things. This desire for gratitude develops to a point where sort of a civil order emerges automatically. In what regard is that decisive for modern markets?
Well, I think with Adam Smith, you see, without property rights, markets can't work. You see, people talk about free markets. There isn't any such thing as a free market not regulated, not, you see, constrained by a recognition of what is thine and what is mine. So fundamentally, all markets require property right forms of regulation. And Adam Smith saw that as property rights in the civil order as growing out of the resentments people feel in their intimate groupings when people perform hurtful acts. So it was natural when you go from the pre-civil order to the modern, more civil order, for a lot of that experience to just come over and become part of what became known as the rule of law. So, and even the asymmetry between gains and losses is there. As Smith points out, the punishment for theft and robbery is greater than that for violation of contract. And he says that's why. He says the reason for that is theft and robbery take from us what we have already possessed. Violation of contract simply frustrates our expectation of gain. And you see, so that's less severe. Now, it's a civil offense, of course, and you can be held accountable if you violate your contract, but it's not a criminal activity. So he takes these fundamental propositions and principles and applies them kind of to real life, which is the thing that I find really quite quite exciting, and I think that's, so the first book really sets the stage for the second. And all he had, the basic thing that he adds in the second book is the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. And when he adds that axiom, he's getting prices and people responding to prices, and specialization then grows out of that. So that's kind of like our propensity to trade is kind of a discovery mechanism. See, it leads to a discovery of all kinds of things that enriches our society.
Yeah. Nevertheless, the second book, The Wealth of Nations, is sort of the as we said earlier, the big bang of modern free market models and thinking, and it's astounding that one and the same person and one and the same brain came up with these two books.
Well, and I think Theory of Moral Sentiments was eclipsed as a major work largely because The Wealth of Nations was so spectacularly successful. William Pitt the Younger was prime minister for 17 years, and he knew the Wealth of Nations well. And in fact, I have a quote of Adam Smith after he met William Pitt the Younger. He says, "He understands my system better than I do." Now that's pretty remarkable for a public person as prominent as William Pitt was.
Definitely, yeah. There's also an interesting idea in the first book, in the Moral Sentiments, about a society being sort of the basis on which that desire for gratitude can only be based, because as a lonesome person on an island you are not able to enjoy society, so you can't develop that desire for appraisal. And do you agree with that, or how do you see it?
Well, that human betterment grows out of our sociability, and I think that's one of the main messages in his first book, that so much of human development is in this social sphere, and the way in which that kind of improves our psychological well-being, you see, is very important. And he saw that as and it's the reason why it's the emphasis on the first book, is that that is kind of necessary before you can take the next big step and develop a national economy.
How could, because you were studying in a highly empirical setup, what a theory, voiced 200 years ago was saying, and you discovered that it has some evidence, you could find some evidence for actually these kind of assumptions about society and economics. Where would that, what would be the next step in experimental economics? Could it be could it become sort of more important in terms of developing methods in testing these kind of assumptions, or?
Oh yes, I think the theory of moral sentiments is rich in enabling us to get kind of new experimental designs to test and further explore his propositions. Almost certainly his batting average can't be as high as I think it has come out in these first tests, but I think there's many issues that I have and my colleague Bart Wilson have been studying and motivated by Adam Smith, but I feel that we're just getting started. We're sort of at that beginning. And I think the whole questions of the transition from kind of a social world into an economic world are ripe for investigation by experimental methods.
Mm-hmm. You are actively working on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
as we speak.
As a scholar, researcher, yeah. Maybe an interesting question always to put to an economist, the wider ramifications for society and practical political decisions of these findings. Is there any you can think of?
Oh, I think the whole idea that, the whole idea of moral action and the idea of self-command, you see in Adam Smith, the notion that ultimately it's the individual, you see, that must take responsibility for his moral actions. That sort of thing is implied. I mean, Adam Smith's not a preacher. He's been basically trying to understand how virtuous behavior is supported by in our social groupings, and where that can go wrong, and of course you can have bad behavior. And I think that has lessons for business, for government, all institutions, churches. You know, none of us as humans are immune from elements of corruption, you see, in which the self-interest is used inappropriately in some. You see, the self-interest works fine in markets if it's channeled in ways that are not corrupted, because it can generate wealth and well-being for everyone.
Would you say that the findings found in the lab can be expanded into or applied to all markets, like financial markets, commodity markets, other markets?
Sure. Yes.
So
I think commodity market. I mean, goods and services markets that involve non-durables are markets that perform extremely well now. If you think about what problems occurred in the Great Recession, what's happening in financial markets, it all has to do with items that can be retraded. And you see, you can't retrade haircuts, hamburgers, hotel rooms, most of the things actually that that are part of the gross domestic product can't be retraded, and those markets behave very, very well. And I think we should keep in mind that that there's a large segment of the economy that does quite well without really with very little interference. There's questions, of course, as to whether certain goods should be legal or not. There are all those issues. There's problems of truth in advertising, truth in labeling, that sort of thing that involves those commodities. But the markets function very well. It's the goods that we not only can buy and use, hold, but we can also buy for resale, that are the markets that create instability.
Such as housing stock, for
yes.
instance.
Good example is housing. Houses last 100 years, and you buy them mostly with other people's money. And that's where the trouble is.